On the Saturday, he went to W11 by taxi to take off the pall. The stairs were freshly painted white and had a scarlet carpet. There was a glass jar of yellow flowers on the landing. It had not occurred to him he himself might have brought. As he went up, he was shamed by a sense of adventure that delineated the reduced scale of his adventures. After the impetuous beginning, he would puzzle them by turning out staid and cautious. In a gilt mirror near the door, he surprised himself, still young. Grace's beauty was a vindication. He had relied on it, and it did not let him down. She was calm as before and smiled. There were the gold flowers again on a table. Christian sat on a furnished-looking settee. No difficulty at all finding the dress, and knew the area quite well, actually, from once having had a dentist nearby. A kettle whistling in a kitchenette was swiftly muzzled by, he assumed, Dora. Caro brought in the tray, my sister. A place was cleared for cups and plates. Christian sat again, and Caro opposite, with Grace bent between them. Is that too strong? These are from Fortnum's. With a silver blade, she laid open a quadrant of cake. A little furrow of concentration between her eyes was beguiling as the grooved brow of a kitten. On the sofa, Christian was a man on a riverbank, not so much gazing at the other side, as aware of a current into which he must plunge. He saw Grace shining and rippling over afternoon stones. She leadeth me beside the still waters. Opposite, Caro's still waters ran deep. Unfortunately, Dora has had to go to Wigmore Street to pick up her new glasses. Thank God. It was clear that Dora, battened on the girls' occasions, might be absent from necessity, but never from tact. As in the concert hall, it was evident they must make the most of the time before she returned, get things to a pitch where she could not reverse them. In relief at no Dora, Christian sat easy, had a second cup, and was pleased. Into the furnished staleness there came cool air from a window and a scent of bath salts or cologne. Against the light, Caro's head and shoulders were remarkable. Once or twice he made her laugh, but when he leant for biscuits, felt her eyes on him as if, for instance, she knew about the sense of adventure on the stairs. He found these women uncommonly self-possessed for their situation. They seemed scarcely conscious of being Australians in a furnished flat. He would have liked them to be more impressed by his having come, and instead caught himself living up to what he thought might be their standards and hoping they would not guess the effort incurred. Quickness came back to him like a neglected talent summoned in an emergency, as if he rose in trepidation to a platform and cleared his throat to sing.
Thank you all for joining us tonight at this very special celebration of the one and only Shirley Hazzard. The voice you heard, of course, was Hazzard's own from her 1981 reading here at the 92nd Street Y from The Transit of Venus, which was published in 1980. 34 years later, it's safe to say that her novel and her work generally has taken on the quality of a cult, a writer to whom many other writers are devoted to warmly and lavishly. And tonight we celebrate that cult in her unique voice, that perfect mid-Atlantic, wonderful tone. And also to welcome the first ever audiobook recording of Transit of Venus, just released from the publisher Spiegel and Grau. And a big thank you to them and to our partner for tonight, the New York Society Library. I'm Lucas Whitman, the executive director of the Unterberg Center for Poetry here at the 92nd Street Y. And we have a wonderful evening prepared for you. First up will be a reading from The Transit of Venus by the actor Emily Mortimer. You will know Emily from her series such as Doll and M, The Newsroom, The Pursuit of Love, which she wrote and directed as well as acted in, and in movies like Mary Poppins, Lars and the Real Girl, Match Point, and many others. She is, like the rest of us, a Hazzard devotee, and she will read from near the end of The Transit of Venus in just a moment. And the second part of the evening will be a conversation between biographer Stacy Schiff, who you all know from her award-winning biographies of Cleopatra, Samuel Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Vera, novelist Roxana Robinson, author of such acclaimed novels as Cost, Leaving, and Dawson's Fall, who also teaches at the MFA program at Hunter College, and the novelist and screenwriter Matthew Specktor, whose novel American Dream Machine and whose new book about Hollywood and family is The Golden Hour, which will be out in April. And we have it on good authority that he's been involved for many years with a screen adaptation of The Transit of Venus. Perhaps more on that in a moment. And the evening tonight will be moderated by one of New York's finest literary citizens, Courtney Hodell, the literary program director at the Whiting Foundation and a brilliant editor. Please welcome Emily Mortimer to the stage.
Thank you. I'm reading from chapter 36, The Culmination. From her place on the sofa, Cara looked on while Grace took Christian his tea. Grace's chin was no longer quite defined, nor her waist. Beneath the clasp of a necklace, her nape was slightly humped. Cara was seeing her sister more tenderly than she had ever done. Childhood closeness had always seemed suspended, as though it might resume. In childhood memories, Grace was always kind. Cara thought it rare that a child should be kind. The dichotomy between them might have stood for more. They had exercised so little influence on each other's lives and exchanged few confidences. It was not even clear now, as formerly, that Grace was satisfied with chintz and china, with Christian saying, "A wee bit fibrous," or hoisting his trousers at evening and announcing, "Must get my 8 hours." It was not quite certain Grace had remained a spectator. Those who had seen her as Caro's alter ego might have missed the point. Grace had presumably passed through an experience that could only be love, or had some inward revelation. Paul Ivory had said, "A state of mind can overtake you like an event." In Caroline Vale's own life and thought, Ted Tice had become supreme. Consciousness of Ted Tice was the event that pervaded her waking and sleeping life. His greatest strength had been his secret. His very truth enclosed his mystery. Caro had been dwelling on memory and on possibilities, remote as memories. For the first time, had dreams in which she and Ted met as lovers in a vivid, unfamiliar land. She would lie awake and think how little, even of kindness, she had ever given him, would remember light, flat, callous words worthy of Paul Ivory. Ted had shown her her own image, and she had said, "I don't recall that dress." She thought how she could go to him and would not. She imagined her arrival, his happiness, his streaked eye, his joy. She pictured Margaret Tice in her golden beauty. Caro looked into her own mirror, clothed or naked, aware of pathos, aware of women before her who had done the same. Her body was a dress, now for years unworn, unshown, unknown. She knew his illusion might fall away, yet it was terrible that she might go to him and would not. Caro had walked in the streets and thought about Ted Tice. She had sat to her work and feared to die without seeing him again. One day she had written on the page where she was working, "If he came now, I would do whatever he asked." If Ted were to die, the world would be a room where no one looked at her. She had no more control over these fantasies than she had had over the bodily changes of adolescence. She tried to see how it had come about and only knew that she had been seeking some extreme, that extreme might be the force, pure and terrible, of a man's attested strength of will. It was as if Ted Tice had created this event in her through the cosmic power of love. She was helpless to change, though not to act. Caro said to Grace, "I'm considering a trip to Australia." "Any particular reason?" "I find I remember it more these days. That seems to create a reason to go there," she said. "Would you come with me?" Grace asked, "For a few weeks, would it be?" They were speaking in lowered voices. Christian, if he heard the sound, would assume that they were discussing ailments and be reassured by their subjection. Caro said, "I'd like to see what I was incapable of seeing then. Of all she had been blind to, at least that much might be retrieved." Grace relived in an instant certain summer nights, walking through a dark house, every door and window wide open for air, an entire city turned expectant towards the sea. She said, "To see the Pacific again." "Do you remember when we were little, Mother would sit out in a cane chair on the lawn at dusk while we played?" Caro was stroking as if maternally the sleeve of her own bronze dress. There was a trellis of climbing roses, a row of hollyhocks, the lemon tree, and the swing. Mother would sit out on summer evenings in a garden chair and watch us. She meant watch over us. Grace said, "That was Dora." Grace got up and went into the next room. She asked Christian, "Did you call me?" "I was only yawning." As she turned away, he said, "You can take the paper, there's nothing in it." Several times in the mornings or evenings, Grace had put aside what she was doing and turned to her husband. She had left the dishes in the sink and gone upstairs to find him. Once he was using his electric razor and could not hear her. Another time, his water pick. Christian was glad to be rid of the newspaper in which there was a letter on treaties signed simply Elphinstone. For Elphinstone, who had received a peerage in the honours list of a departing prime minister, now wrote frequently on public matters. At the time of the peerage, Christian had swallowed his pride and telephoned to congratulate. Greeted kindly enough by Mrs. or Lady E, he had heard a background voice say, "For God's sake, don't put me on." Christian told Grace, "I can't get excited because Elphinstone slept with somebody at Downing Street." Grace returned to the living room carrying the newspaper. She sat on the sofa at Caro's side. "I meant to show you this." There was a photograph of scientists leaving a government conference. Flanked by politicians, Ted Tice looked straight ahead. He had the private, civilized face one sees on the interpreter between two grimacing heads of state. "You'll see that he'll be in Sweden while you're there." Grace read out that Professor Tice would present a paper on the controversial theme. Grace had an advantage here, having learned from her sons about black holes, redshift, the Big Bang. "I dare say you knew." "I haven't called Ted this time." Grace watched while Caro handled the tassel of a cushion. She said, "So much happens in your life." "It only happens to me. Your life has meaning for others." Caro had never seen Grace shrug before. She went on, "How can a life be motiveless when others depend on it?" Grace smiled, abnegation as statement. Neither of them had forgotten the nursing home, the television screen, how Charmian Thrale had said, "They are already dead," of those who had lost track of their own absurdity. Grace suddenly asked, "Did you love Paul Ivory?" "Yes." "I suppose it ended badly." "Yes." "You must have been very unhappy." "I died and Adam resurrected me." Intending to say this lightly, Caro gave in to deadly earnest. They were throwing caution to the winds as their only outlet for violent feeling. "I saw you once in the street together. The way you kept apart, not to be seen touching, Grace said. I wish I'd known or helped, but you could not depend on me for your stability. What help for that matter was I to you? Oh, by then I was presumed stabilized. Same smile, neither bitter nor complacent. Caro said, Can I help you now? No. They sat, inclined towards each other, and exchanged some pain for a tragedy not exclusively theirs. Grace got up and went to the piano as to a haven. They then turned and looked at Caro. At first, there is something you expect of life. Later, there is what life expects of you. By the time you realize these are the same, it can be too late for expectations. What we are being, not what we are to be. They are the same thing. Caro said, I don't know that suspense ever ends. The suspense of life itself, then the expectation of death. Valda had once said, there's the waiting. By suspense, women meant the desire to love, be loved, great expectations. Even small expectations are part of the larger uncertainty. Waiting for an arrival, a phone call, a letter. Grace said, oh, a letter is the worst. Grace stood by the piano facing Caro. Had she turned away, Caro would have got up to embrace her, would have said, darling, like a lover. As it was, they remained in place, looking at one another. Grace said, is there someone now whom you love? When Caro did not answer, she went on, because you seem more handsome to me now than you ever were. I was remembering, Caro said, that you were generous, even as a child, not something that occurs by accident. Grace stood by the piano, listening. Caro said, if Ted calls, the corners of her lips were not quite civilized. It seemed she might not speak again. High feeling was ultrasonic, audible. If Ted Tice rings up, I don't want him to know I'll be in Sweden or to see him there. Grace had not foreseen her sister could develop such a mouth, but was thinking of the letter, instant, full, unflawed by delay, that could never now arrive, or of the letter paid by particular suffering, a slow inward bleeding of hope and humiliation that likewise could not exist. There might be eventual word, by then unawaited, non-committal, a fleeting touch on the wound. Meantime, she had learned to shrug. Grace had discovered that men prefer not to go through with things. When the opposite occurred, it made history, something you'll always remember. She said, women have to go through with things, birth, for instance, or hopeless love. Men can evade forever. There were expectations. Ted Tice or her own son, it would be dreadful if Rupert were to lay down his life as Ted had done. Dreadful and not unlikely. Light came through long windows. There was scent from stock in a vase. Two women were silent, one seated, one standing, while a man slept like a baby in an adjoining room. Thank you.
What a beautiful reading.
Yeah.
So you lucky folks just heard a very dramatic section toward the end of the book. You got to meet some anti-heroes, you got to meet some heroes, in particular Caro, the Australian transplant orphan, Ted Tice, an astrophysicist, working class, British, and you got the sense of a love affair that has been played out tremblingly, waitingly, for about 3 decades. So that's just setting the scene. We are all so lucky to hear Matthew, Stacy, and Roxana talk about their combined many decades of rereading of this book. Their knowledge is profound. For those of you in the audience who've read it and love it, you'll find yet more in it. For those who have not yet fallen under its spell, tonight you might find the key that unlocks the secret garden. So we're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take some questions, so start thinking about those now. So to kick us off, I just want to share a few bits of her biography, because it's a fascinating life. It's a big, unexpected life, one that she felt was marked by destiny, which is something that really figures in the book. So she was born in Australia. Her father was a diplomat, her mother a beautiful woman of difficult personality. They moved to Hong Kong during World War II when she was just 16, and she took a job as a typist in the British Combined Intelligence Offices. This was the end of her formal education, the beginning of her monumental self-education. It's the first glimpse that she got that life might be for enjoyment. It's also where she had her first love affair with a much older man. But her sister was ill. They returned to Australia, which she described as a kind of death. And then the family was transferred to New York. She began a clerical job at the UN, and this is where her career of noticing everything and forgetting nothing began. So, Matthew, you actually spent a lot of time with Shirley for a while. Can you tell us about...
but during a pretty narrow span of time, I think. I met Shirley in 1999, and by that time I had I think just moved back to Los Angeles when I first met her. She and I had kind of an epistolary relationship, and then I came back to New York, I remember, to meet her and to ostensibly to interview her for the Paris Review, but really because I just wanted to know her. And it happened to correspond with a time when I was writing an adaptation of the movie for Warner Brothers. So she was very curious about that and probably overindulged my company. So yeah, between 2000 and 2005, I knew her quite well. And then I moved to LA with my young child and family, and we kind of fell off touch.
But you had a friendship based on your passionate attachment to the reading of the book.
Yes.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So all of you have had a very signal, interesting reaction to your first read. Can you
Yes.
talk about that a little bit?
Yes. Well, I know, I read it when I was doing a sort of exhausting job working for a movie studio that had me reading a lot of things that were terrible. And so when I took the book by chance with me on a kind of long weekend vacation, and it just floored me. I couldn't believe that anything could be that good. And so I wrote her a letter. I looked her up in the phone book, and I wrote her a letter, and I said to her that I think I compared my experience reading it to the experience of reading Middlemarch and Anna Karenina. I said, as ludicrous as that sounds, or as extravagant as that sounds, and she wrote me back, and we became, pen pals, as they used to say, and then friends. Yeah.
But it's not always easy to enter into this book. And Stacy, can you talk about your early experiences?
Yeah, the difference between Matthew and me is that when it was suggested that I meet her, I was far too intimidated by how good the book was to meet her. So I'm entirely jealous. Yeah. I don't remember my first reading. I remember my second reading, which is a little bit true to what Shirley Hazzard's husband, Francis Stiegmuller, said when he said no one should have to read this book for the first time. And I had exactly the reaction you had, of just perfect match of intimacy and epic. The details are perfect, the overlying themes are perfect, every piece is intricately plotted. But every time I go back to it, we can talk about this, the rereadings are always different. And even on this reading, I remember finding things that I'd never realized how much the part titles play in the rest of the text. But that first experience of it is the richest possible novel into which one can fall.
Almost possibly too rich.
Too rich.
Because I know that I had picked it up a few times and sort of started reading it and thought, well, the writing is really beautiful, but I felt a little bit, I just couldn't I didn't feel invited.
It was an enameled feel to it,
Yes,
right?
it took about
Yeah.
40, I had to sort of be alone with it for a couple hours before I finally pierced the veil. And other friends who are also devotees, Michael Ondaatje, the wonderful writer, said that he had the same experience. I think that's common. Roxana, did you have any resistance to it when you first
No,
encountered it?
when I first read it, I read it when it came out. This was my 1980 copy. And two friends of mine and I all read it together. I mean, we read it when it came out. And it was just like finding another planet. I mean, I had never read anything so beautiful, so exquisite on every level, emotionally and aesthetically, and in terms of the literary quality. And one of my friends knew her, and so we went to a reading that she gave at the New York Society Library. So that was right around when the time when the book came out, and they introduced me. And then I knew her, and then we went to Naples, and she took me on a walking tour of Naples and lunch at her apartment in Posillipo, where there were nightingales in the garden.
Naturally.
Of course. Well, actually, I didn't hear them. They only sing at night, and this was lunch. But they come from Africa, and so they pause in Naples on their way to England, where they're going to sing in Berkeley Square. But she was an exquisite host, and she wrote a wonderful description of Naples for, I think, the Encyclopedia Britannica, which she gave me, which explains why Naples is so different from Rome or Paris or other great European cities, how it doesn't have grand boulevards or public spaces. It's intimate. And so she took us on this walking tour of her favorite places. And there was one, she took us into a cafe, and she said that she always went to the cafe next door because of something or other. And then one week that cafe had been closed, and she went to this cafe. And the man said, "Signora, I have watched you come here week after week after week. This is the first time you have ever come here." And she said, "You know, this is what it's like to be an American in Naples. There's a big sign around you saying, 'I'm not from here.'" But anyway, so we became friends. We used to have lunch here in New York, and her apartment here and her apartment in Naples were both surprisingly modern. I was expecting some ancient place that sort of referred to history, and that's not what they were like at all. They were very spare and austere. Some beautiful old drawings, but the furniture and the space was very open and fresh, and you had the sense that she was always ready for the next wave of fresh air.
There's an exquisite balance in her writing, too, between something that feels very classical and antique and something that feels still, almost 50 years after it was published, shockingly modern.
Shocking.
And I think that might be some of that barrier that some people feel on first reading her. I think Jeff Dyer said, he was talking to you about this once, I think, and he said that he tried very hard to read the book, got 40 pages into it, set it aside for 20 years, and then picked it up again when she published her next novel. It was that long between novels, and felt the shock of the great. So can we talk a little bit about the peculiar craft of Shirley Hazzard and the demands or the contract she tries to make with the reader, that you shall read closely, and how that plays out in the book?
Can I just say that I was rereading it for the third time. I reread it, 3 weeks ago, and then I started rereading it again. I don't know that if you picked this up or if you did, but in the very first 5 pages are presented the 3 pillars on which the narrative depends.
Yes. Yes.
So you picked that up.
Well, but certainly not on first reading. I mean, there are essential facts, keys to the entire book that just wash right past you at the beginning, because you're just trying to
glints in the
and yet they're right there.
Right there.
Yeah, and you can't know what they mean until you get to the final paragraph. It's wild.
Dazzling.
Yeah.
Just dazzling.
Yeah.
That's interesting because it speaks to this theme that I mentioned earlier, that of destiny and of the ways characters move in and out of each other's lives over a span of many, many years. And I wonder if we could talk about the title, this enigmatic title, what it means, and how it plays out in our sense of the characters and what happens to them.
Well, it also comes up in those first pages.
Yes.
Because
And the story of the
the story of the transit of Venus and the discovery of Australia.
Yes.
But told in a sort of in a misdirected, almost prejudiced sort of way.
Yes.
You know, Captain Cook got a little lost on his trip. But there's a wonderful reference in those early pages to, which you don't pick up on yet again, to an astronomer who missed the transit of Venus, but hung out.
What is the transit of Venus?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Anyone want to do the astrology here?
Astronomy. It's the moment. It's the passage of Venus across the face of the sun.
Where you see the image.
And it happens right. It was a thing that astronomers had long wanted to observe. I think because it would have allowed them to calculate the distance of the Earth from the sun. I think.
Ask us.
Yeah. No, I don't know. But there was the story, the anecdote that gets that gets told at the beginning is about how various astronomers had tried to, had traveled across the world to observe it from a particular vantage point and been thwarted, by a meteorological storm or bad weather and
then a war.
Yeah, and war. Yeah. So the story is kind of a metaphor for people devoting their lives to the pursuit of something that is stolen from them, or a kind of a moment that they miss due to some freak accident of fate, and that of course is a not to give anything away, but that is a kind of essential. Yes, a kind of mirror of what the novel itself is about.
To say nothing of Venus.
Yes, of course.
Who also comes up later.
Yes.
As you all observed, this is, I can't remember whose words these were, but it is a swooningly romantic love story.
Yes. I mean, that is the part that can feel almost old-fashioned, and yet it is kind of leavened with or cut with this, this shockingly modern quality, this dispassionate, I don't want to say coldness, because the book is not cold at all, but a kind of galactic remove, so that you're both, seeing these people in a way that is unbearably intimate, and also kind of forced to observe them as very, very tiny.
Because she can go in a
figures.
Paragraph
Yes.
in a truly astronomical
Yes,
way,
her
from the
ability
macro to the micro within a sentence. Even.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
It's incredible.
Yes, her powers of compression are unbelievable.
Yeah.
But I'd like to return to this thing that she does, which is sort of working with this notion of destiny and prefiguring. And if you're reading closely in the first pages, you know the ending of the book.
Yeah.
But how does she hide it? Where does she tuck it away?
Yeah, I mean.
Roxana, do you want to?
Well, she tells these. She gives us three facts in the very first 5 pages, which mean nothing until the end. But one is, in the aftermath of the storm, there's a body found after a dam fails. There's a high window in the front wall of the house where everyone is staying. And and the third one is that Ted Tice, the young astronomist, has been on a walking tour in the west of England. And those 3 facts become electrified. They become neon in the book, but they are slipped in, as is Ted's eventual fate. So we're told very early on that Ted kills himself long before he should die. So we're given these facts with no context, and then she creates the most dazzling tapestry of context, which is both facts and an emotional narrative, which is so powerful and so rich and so deep that it's kind of unsettling. You can't figure out whether you're reading a love story or this intricate, intellectual, erudite narrative about that is written in this Arctic, as you say, Arctic tone and unflinching, and yet the engine of this book is Venus, is the love story.
And she writes about emotion with such understanding and depth.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Maybe we should rest on that very high up window. Would you like to read that?
Yes, do you have the page?
I do, I think. Let me see if I can find it. There we go.
So this is, to give you the context, this is Caro, who's pretty much the main character in the book, a beautiful Australian woman who has come to London. And she's in the countryside living with an older astronomist, and she's in love with someone she should not be in love with. The person she's in love with is named Paul Ivory. He knew that Caro had come up, so how much time? So the two of them are in his bedroom in this house, and they can hear outside that the aristocratic woman from nearby who lives in a castle has driven up outside the house. They can hear her car arrive.
Shall we say who she is?
Her name is Tertia. And in this book, Shirley does these wonderful sort of Dickensian choices of names. So that Caro, the main character, is called Beloved, and her sister Grace, they're both called Belle. They're both beautiful. Their last name is Belle. And Tertia, who is Paul Ivory's fiancée, might as well be called the triangle, the love triangle. That's her name, is Tertia. And Paul Ivory, is the bad boy that she loves, is smooth, beautiful, exotic, and has death in his past. He knew that Caro had come up behind him and was by his side at the window. Her bare shoulder, perfectly aloof, touched his own. He did not turn, but as if he himself were Tertia Drake, saw Caro standing naked beside him at that high window and looking down on the two of them. It was he and Tertia and Caroline Bell looking down on them. Caro's hand rested on the sill. She was wearing nothing but a small round watch. Moments passed or did not pass. Tertia stood impassive, only that her arm stayed raised, her gloved fist clenched and extended like a falconer's. She was looking straight up at Paul and staring, not staring, but looking hard and fast at him only. She said, "It's up to you." He said, "I'll come down."
What do you all make of that?
There is so much, I was thinking about this earlier. I love that scene. It's one of my favorite things in the book. But there are many scenes in the book that involve one character looking down at another from elevation. And, you know, when Caro first sees Ted, she's looking down on him from the upstairs landing. There's that. When before Caro meets Adam Vale, the man who will become her husband, she sees him on the street outside her apartment. He's looking up at her window and he looks down and they make eye contact. There is that is a very, that's a thing that recurs throughout the novel and I think speaks to, Courtney, you and I were talking about how much the book has to do with power and how imbalances of power and imbalances of class are, orchestrated throughout the book, and that scene, which is just so great, because Paul he's engaged to Tertia, isn't he? When
Not yet. I mean,
not formally, but
Professor Thrale says he's all but engaged.
Yes,
so
yes.
We don't know what.
So so for Caro to sort of basically show up naked at the window when the woman that he will ultimately marry is pulling up in the driveway, that's a power move, is what that is. Yeah.
Are there other moments in the book that you see the power being played out that starkly?
Oh, I think the whole book is about exchanges of power. I mean, between the half-sister and Caro, between Caro and the lovers, I mean, even the minor characters have power issues. The captain who kind of walks in out of the blue, the girls in the office, which is this like deeply feminist little page and a half of the book. I feel like there's power in almost every exchange.
That's right.
And that framing is interesting because I feel like it's like a picture gallery within the novel, that you keep getting these like framed, including the opening scene, right? These practically, you can almost see the guilt of the picture around the words.
Yes.
You've spoken really beautifully about the sense of painting and of framing in the book. What function does that serve? Is that to make us enter the illusion, this living illusion, or is there something else at work?
I'm not sure, I think that it actually is part of what we're saying is off-putting about those early pages, that there's a still life aspect to the whole thing. And it's almost as if she needs to still the reader before bringing the reader into this enchanted world on some level. But I think it has to do with having, there's such intelligence at work here that you have microscopically pinned your character to the page. So it's almost a merciless examination at the same time as a deeply passionate one.
Yeah, as she does at the moment when Ted Tice arrives in the rainstorm with his cheap suitcase.
The dissolving suitcase.
A dissolving cardboard suitcase that's leaking dye all over the floor. Yeah, it's an incredible opening. There's so much happening in it. And I can't remember which of you observed that this is really where she's establishing what it is to be an outsider, which is something she knew a great deal about. Can you talk about that?
I think you and I had that conversation that the book is on one level really about outsiders, and Ted Tice is certainly an outsider with his lower class accent and his awkwardness, his social awkwardness. But it's everybody in the book is striving on some level. Professor Thrale is striving. He's jealous that Paul is marrying the aristocrat, so he's not at that level. Everybody is an outsider on some level. Certainly the Australians are outsiders to London. And she sort of revels in discussing the outsiderness that every person feels. Dora is always an outsider wherever she goes. So she sort of makes that into a magic kingdom, the kingdom of the outsiders. Everyone is always struggling in some way. Adam Vale, who is a sort of a consummate insider, goes to that meeting with the government officials, and they have more power than he does. He's denied clemency. He's denied any power that he might have had, and he's an American, so he's also an outsider. So she's playing with this fact of the insiders versus the outsiders all the time, and power. And there's the great scene in which Tertia says to Caro, "What are you wearing? What are we wearing tonight?" And it's an incredible put down for her to ask, as though Caro was under some obligation to tell this aristocrat what she was wearing. And Caro overwhelms her by holding up her belt and not answering. So she's constantly aware of who's on the inside, who's on the outside. So that's one of the great themes of the book.
I'd love to talk too about the power of characters who are weak. And you've heard Dora's name many times.
Yeah.
And Matthew, you got to hear a little bit about the real life Dora from Shirley.
I did. I don't know about the real life Dora, but there is a marvelous passage in the book describing, we mentioned Adam Vale, who becomes Caro's husband. And he is a widower of a woman that he has lived with. His previous wife had committed suicide in front of him, actually. And the scene that describes that, which is very brief, but she talks about she describes so beautifully the way in which a depressed person or a weak person can dominate a healthy one, emotionally. And I think in a lot of ways throughout the book there are weak characters who are weak in different ways, casting, exerting dominance over the strong. There is a sense in which, Caro is hypnotized by Paul Ivory, who turns out to be, utterly without a moral center, and that, or Dora, who is Caro and Grace's older half-sister and sort of caretaker or ward, and she's so, she sort of bullies them with her own, kind of emotional passivity. And I asked Shirley, I said to her, how did you come to understand that? Because we were talking about things in my life that had led me to understand that in my own experience in history. And she said that when she was a little girl, her mother had once turned on the oven and proposed to Shirley that they both place their heads inside it, which was really quite shocking. I think you described her mother as a difficult personality, and I think there might have been a little bit more to it than difficulty. I think there was probably some real mental illness. Yeah.
It's a very vivid portrait, and amazingly, she makes Dora very funny, too.
Yes, I mean, this is the thing. Even the characters who are bullies. I mean, Christian Thrale, who's just so awful in his sort of pompous, mid-level English bureaucrat way. They are human, these people, and she presents them to us as figures of some comedy. But also,
Dora who will squeeze herself into the revolving door so as to cause you less trouble.
Yes, exactly. So it's that ability to kind of render these people in a way that's not, she's certainly not pulling punches, but she is not just tormenting them either. Even those people are quite human.
Stacy, you're an incredibly accomplished biographer, and you found a treasure for us in the archives, as a good biographer does. Can you tell us about that?
So the novel came out in 1980, and in 1973, in the fall of 1973, Shirley Hazzard applied for a Guggenheim fellowship. And so I went back to how she described the book. So she'd been working on it, this is 1973, presumably she'd been working on it for 3 or 4 years at this point. And I'll read you what she says in a second, but I should say 2 of her referees both say that she'd been working on a modest scale, and this was going to be her first attempt to really kind of increase her range. Here's how she describes The Transit of Venus. The novel in which I'm now engaged will portray the separate related lives of half a dozen main characters against the accelerating changes of the past 20 years and the effects of increasingly pervasive public events on private conduct and consciousness. It will suggest the persistence of human attachments and characteristics, or their attrition, in conditions of increased officialism and latent disorder. I might emphasize that the work will be entirely expressed through its characters and not through any stated social context. I mention the chronological sequence and topical influences because they can be delineated, while the protagonists must speak for themselves. My book will take place in the United States and in Europe. The background will be less one of place than of time, although a developing sameness of place will be a theme. The length should be something over 300 pages at least, but I cannot yet estimate it exactly. And I would make a case for the fact that that describes pretty much nothing of the book before us, which I find deeply reassuring, right? That she'd been working on it for 3 or 4 years and could not describe what she was doing.
Right.
It also sounds to me like she had taken either she's making herself sound more pompous than she was, or she had taken some unusual turns which she then turned back from. And I think the only thing she got right was the page count.
Yeah.
It's an extraordinary document because, 7 years later, we have this, which arrives with a sense of inevitability, from first page to last. And it's just a remarkable tribute to the interior journey a writer goes on, that there can be that kind of patterning from that beginning. But there are some interesting little hints in it of something that's very important in the book, which you've all noted, which is her sense of history, the great canvas against which these individual stories are playing out.
And that sense that time is our medium. It's 50 years, this book, right? Yeah. And wars are fought in a single sentence, right? A paragraph may be devoted to an emotion, but a war can pass in a sentence.
Can you give us an example of that?
What's the wonderful line about the belt being tied around Caro's waist, and she's one age when it begins and a different age when it ends. I can look it up.
That's wonderful.
Matthew probably knows it by heart.
I don't know. I'm trying to remember. The one I always think of is where she sort of dispatched.
The white man in
Yeah,
inside and the black man on the
black man
veranda.
had been shot to death on a
exactly.
Can you say that a little bit more slowly so people
Yeah.
can understand?
Well, I'm trying to remember the first half of the sentence. A white man had been shot to death in, is it Bobby Kennedy? Who's she?
Bobby Kennedy.
Yeah.
She says inside and a black
In
man.
a kitchen,
had
and a
been
black
shot
man
outside.
had been shot to death on a veranda. She handles the moon landing. It's like there's this.
She handles a Russian novelist,
Yes.
right? Everything in
Right.
sort of 2 sentences,
Yeah.
and the world has then just turned in another evolution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the history matters extremely in the sense that the characters are being moved along in this great sweep of it.
Yes.
And the novel's really bracketed by war. There's a sense of the war. All the great wars of that century are a very strong presence in this.
All the political events, but they come up in the text as they would in the lives of the characters. You find, Paul or Ted writing to Caro about them in a letter, talking about, I was thinking about, just this morning as I kind of flipped through a copy, I saw, lines about where she talked about, she says something like, the opposition to the Soviet menace is so deranged that one can almost forget that the menace is real. She's talking about the American kind of anti-communist fervor. There's sort of the events of the world are very woven into the lives of the people we're
She's in school and she looks up Pearl Harbor on the map.
Yes.
That's how we know Pearl Harbor has happened.
Yes.
Right? So it's a very oblique
Yeah.
approach, which doesn't tally with, when we're talking about the emotional resonance of the book, it's almost as if they're two completely different registers and somehow she marries the two.
Yeah.
Yes. One of the aspects of history that comes into the book in kind of a slant way is the question of feminism.
Yes.
And I'd like to read just a few lines from her biography. And the biographer, Brigitte Olibas, talks about what she calls Transit's untimely relation to feminism. So she says, the second wave of feminism was exploding all around during the years of Transit's writing, but it's barely evident in the pages. Shirley Hazzard's concern with women's authority and agency in the world was expressed through other modes. A philosopher friend described our beloved character, Caro, as one of the great women characters of the modern novel, someone we recognize for a kind of strength at a time when feminism was not in the air, and so women possessed of such strength as hers had no peg of doctrine to hang it on. Caro's situation is particularly poignant because, unlike her great antecedents, Emma Bovary, Anna Karenina, and Dorothea Brooke, she lives and loves in the decade just before the turn to feminism.
Yes.
How do you see that playing out in the book?
Well, there is the great passage in which Valda refuses to make tea.
Yes.
Boss.
Yes.
There's no other way to read that
Yes.
except as an eruption of feminism right in the middle of Caro's life. Caro doesn't really respond. She doesn't take it up, but it's absolutely unmistakable that Shirley's saying, right, and there's this too that is going on.
Actually, Matthew, you had that passage.
Yeah, sure.
Didn't you?
Yeah.
Give it, because I picked
can
it
borrow
too.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so
Is that
much.
all that you wanted?
Yes. No, actually, hang on.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. I think I've almost got it. Okay. Yes. Girls were getting up all over London, in striped pajamas, in flowered Viola nightgowns, in cotton shifts they had made themselves and unevenly hemmed, or in sheer nylon to which an old cardigan had been added for warmth. Girls were pushing back bedclothes and groping for slippers. They were tying the cords of dressing gowns and pulling pins from their hair. They were putting the shilling in the meter and the kettle on the gas ring. Those who shared were nudging each other out of the way and saying, "And it's only Tuesday." Those who lived alone were moaning and switching on radio or television. Some said prayers, one sang. It is hard to say what they had least of, past, present, or future. It is hard to say how or why they stood it, the cold room, the wet walk to the bus, the office in which they had no prospects and no fun, the weekends washing hair and underwear and going in despondent pairs to the pictures. For some who could not have done otherwise, it was their fate, decreed by mum, dad, and a lack of funds or gumption. Others had come from the ends of the earth to do it, had arrived from Auckland or Karachi or Joburg, having saved for years to do just this, having wrung or cajoled the wherewithal out of tear-stained parents. Not all were very young, but all, or nearly all, wished for a new dress, a boyfriend, and eventual domesticity. No two, however, were identical, which was the victory of nature over conditioning, advertising, and the behavioral sciences. No triumph, but an achievement against the odds. Yeah, one could pick one could pick any paragraph, any sentence out of this book for special commendation. It never lapses, but there's something about the depiction of, women, these women, who are leading a pre-feminist life in London, where this is their, this is what's available to them. If they are not an aristocrat, they are, off to be secretaries in the hopes of perhaps meeting a husband. And I just think the tactility of that passage and it's just beautiful, right? Yeah.
It is. As is the passage when Caro goes in to tell her boss.
Yes.
That, well, he would like to perhaps fire her, but she gets to it first by saying, "I'm leaving."
Yes.
So there's a wonderful play of power,
so
and that's one of those delicious scenes.
Yeah.
And there's a reckoning with everyone we kind of don't like in the novel has to reassess who and what Caro is. And you called out that absolutely wonderful line. Your NPR
she's
review.
been reattributed like an old master like a painting that was anonymous, but because she marries, this is a context, she marries a rich American, and instead of being an Australian spinster, she becomes reattributed like a painting that was anonymous, but is now attributed to an old master.
You told me an anecdote that I was very startled by. You were at a Shirley Hazzard event and you asked her a question.
So when her book Green on Capri came out, she gave a talk, a reading at the Century, and that book opens with Shirley Hazzard's meeting with Graham Greene, and it took place in a cafe in Capri, which we went to. Everybody goes there. It's in the main square, and she was sitting alone at a table, and Graham Greene and a friend were sitting at the next table, and he couldn't remember the ending of a passage from a Victorian poem. And he says it over and over to his friend, and he says, "What's the last sentence? What's the last sentence?" And Shirley is reading next to them, and she doesn't know them. And in a gesture, just like one of the gestures in this book, when she's finished her tea, she pays for it and stands up and says the last line for him. She says, "It ends like this," and gives him the line, and then walks out of the cafe. And it's winter. There are no tourists there, so he must find out who she is. So he finds out who she is and meets her, and he's kind of shattered that this woman, this strange woman, could have told him what he was looking for. And she said that it was very easy. As a child, she memorized lots of Victorian poems, that once you have the narrative and you have the rhythm and the rhyme, it's very easy to memorize. So she knew all of Victorian poetry. But it started them off on an uneven footing, because he liked to be in charge, and at that moment, Shirley was in charge. And so she writes this wonderful, charming book about him being on Capri, and she and Frances had an apartment there. And when she finished giving the talk, I said to her, because I didn't think of him as being particularly friendly to women, and I said, what was it like when one of your books came out? Because she was very generous about his books and what they meant and how graceful and powerful they were. And I said, what was it like when one of your books came out? How did he respond? Dead silence. And then she said something like, he didn't like to talk about my books. So it was very clear that he was maintaining that power structure.
Do you think he read them?
That's a good question. I have no idea. Probably not. Yeah, that would be the way to deal with it.
I heard in an interview that she gave that she said she was not the writer in the household. She was married to an eminent biographer, and he was considered the writer, and she was the one who, as she said, fixed the dishwasher if the dishwasher broke. But here we are talking about her novel 50 years after the fact. So morality isn't a terribly sexy word when it comes to literary fiction. It's feels dreary to contemplate, almost like someone's going to lecture us or look down on us. But it is a thrilling, electric presence in this novel.
Yeah.
How does she manage that?
I think she lets us see, first of all, morality wins in the end of the day, right? But she lets us find our way there very gradually. I mean, it was very clear where she stands, as we've made clear with Dora, with any number of other characters, with Paul Ivory. But she lets this grow on us. Everything in this novel interconnects. The intricacy is really rather startling. And the moral parallels are also just perfectly designed. I mean, they just lock into place. But she lets it play out, I think, very gradually and pulling the reader along at her own pace. There's no sort of attempt to sort of stuff this into a box. And everything feels very natural for that reason. But you never lose sight of the fact that Caro is always referred to as someone for whom excellence and heroism and sovereign power is attributed. You know who the good guys are. You don't know entirely how rotten some people are until the end of the book.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a big piece of withheld knowledge there to which Roxanne
Do you
referred.
feel, as a reader, that she's extending this sort of mantle of morality to you? Do you feel like she's welcoming you into this world of being someone who knows the right way?
Sounds like you do, Courtney.
Yeah.
It's really,
That's an
it's just
interesting question.
occurring to
Yeah.
me right now
Yeah.
that I do feel, I talked about the contract she makes with the reader.
Right.
I feel honored by her faith in my intelligence as a reader when I come to this book.
Yes.
But I just wondered now if there's a further extension toward the morality.
I feel like you think the world has been righted when you get to the end of
Yes.
the book, right?
I think
And that's a very welcoming, it's an embrace of a kind.
I do think the book is asserting, in kind of no uncertain terms, without lecturing about it in any way, but asserting that one's conduct in the world, one's private and romantic conduct, and one's ethical conduct, one's larger ethical conduct, those things are linked. It sort of reminds you that that one's private feelings are not ethically immaterial.
And I think it adds to the romance of the book, because Adam Vale is such a paragon of morality. I mean,
Yes.
there aren't that many heroes you can point to who have his kind of gravitas. And it's why that's such an extraordinary, he's a very familiar character from Hazzard, but he's not a familiar character, I think, in literature.
Yeah.
Roxana?
Yeah, I think morality is really lies at the core of the book, and the great emotional shift that takes place as a result of morality. And betrayal is one of the themes of the book. Almost everybody in the book betrays somebody else. Even Caro betrays Ted when she gives his secret away. The one person who never betrays anyone and who never betrays humanity. Humanity is betrayed over and over again by the government officials, by Paul Ivory, by Christian Thrale when he refuses to help Dora. He says, "Well, no, I shouldn't get into this." I mean, there's moment after moment of betrayal. And she does it, as you say, Stacy, she does it on a very subtle level, so that in the very opening passage when we are listening to Professor Thrale's, and she mocks his language, which is perfectly ordinary language. Say what you will, he says, but they can't, of course, because he's their host. Say whatever you want. No. So she constantly is reminding us of the way people lie or present themselves falsely on very simple, ordinary ways. And then we go further and further into the depths of a kind of depravity, the kind of way that you can betray someone so profoundly that there's a loss of life, or so one person betrays the government and saves a life, and one person, are we getting a message? Oh.
Questions.
One person is responsible for the loss of life, and somebody else betrays the government and is responsible for saving a life. And she presents these huge moral choices as the core, the underpinning of the book, which has many more elements of it, but morality lies at the base of this book. It's the center.
Where does this book sit in the pantheon, and where should it sit?
Well, according to this cult, it should sit at the
Yeah.
very top. The very, very top.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always hesitant. Canons irritate me in a lot of ways. I mean, I think that
Canons come and canons go.
Canons come and canons go. Canons are constantly being, reformatted and rearranged and reinvented, which of course is great. But I also just feel like, this is a greater book by almost any measure than many, maybe even most of the books that we think of as being kind of central to the American canon. I mean, it's like, I don't know. I mean, The Great Gatsby is a wonderful novel. Is it as good as this one? I don't think so. But I also think, and I'm hesitant to sort of say cult. I mean, it's true. If there were any book I would be willing to shave my head for, and this would be the one. But it's I think it has a very that quality that we were just discussing, the kind of ways in which morality and ethics are so central to it, without ever being hectoring or lecturing. She's never moralizing. It's more just a book that really reminds you that these things have weight in the world, and which is not a modern sentiment. Most of the comparably great late 20th century novels don't go there. That's not really, not in that way, and it's extraordinary. It is a book that I think, that kind of central fact of being human. I can't think of any other contemporary novel that allows that, and that allows something as basic as a love story, as private, consuming romantic passion, to also have that weight. It's amazing, and that is the kind of conjoinment that I think can save a life. Frankly, it kind of saved mine when I read it.
But it is a deeply old-fashioned book. And I feel like it's like the best 19th century novel written in the 20th century.
Yeah,
What it basically is, right?
Well, we have some questions from the audience, which I will share with you. How does Transit of Venus fit into her body of work, and are her other novels its equal?
I think it's her best.
Yes.
I think it's absolutely her best.
It's the masterpiece.
It's
Yes.
the masterpiece.
How does it differ from the ones that came before? Maybe we can go into more detail there.
They're all delicious, her books. They are such a delight to read. But this one is perfectly formed. It's perfectly formed.
It has a scale that is greater, as Stacy, as the Guggenheim thing that you read, points out, it has a scale that is greater than all the books that came before it. Mm-hmm. But I think it is more persuasive, and kind of more better formed as a narrative than the one that came after.
She also seems to have a style in this book which she doesn't use in The Great Fire later, right? There's that weird conversational tick, with the sentences are very awkward. I mean, it's almost as if she learned a new language for this book and this book alone.
Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that incredible?
Lauren Groff pointed that out as well, that there's a kind of a stylization of some of the dialogue, like for the example of the government officials, where she's only pulling a few words out of each platitudinous sentence that they might utter. And so there's a kind of jazzy syncopation to it, but it's also revealing the utter hollowness. So she's found a way of just pulling into the narrative only the moments of speech that matter most, which can give it a very startling sort of rhythmical sense. But it's not like you're following along on a conversation and having it make sense to you.
Yeah. Right. So like you get a couple of notes of jazz suddenly in the middle of the book, right? In the middle of a sentence, yeah.
Okay, can you speak about representations of family and sisterhood in transit? Something about that is so essential and yet quite alienating.
It's really interesting. Family is sort of fractured in this book. There isn't an image of a close, warm, supportive, mutually helpful family. The Thrales are kind of awkward and unreal, inauthentic. Everybody in that family is inauthentic. And the two sisters, Caro and Grace, really only come together in that beautiful passage read by Emily. But for the rest of the time, they are not helpful to each other. It's not a book in which family plays an important part as a functioning unit, I would say. What do you think?
Even in that passage, there's that plaintive line about the two of them had relatively little to do with each other, had relatively little impact, which isn't entirely true, of course, on each other's lives. I feel that you're absolutely right. I hadn't really thought about that before, that no family works, including Adam Vale's family, right? This person who was otherwise to us such an ideal. Even he has a sort of distant relationship with his daughter. The one character who I think doesn't work in the book, by the way.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Does not work.
Right.
The daughter.
Fully formed.
Yeah. It's almost as if Shirley didn't really live in New York.
Yeah. But of course, Shirley herself, as we kind of alluded to in her biography, I mean, I think Shirley did have a sister, right? And I think they had a somewhat unbalanced relationship.
Not a very close one.
Yeah, exactly.
So not the way Grace and Caro are. I think they were quite at odds with each other.
Yeah, that's.
I think they struggled over the care of her mother.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Shirley worked as a translator at the UN. Do you see a connection between that career and the themes, style, and mood in her fiction?
And the themes what?
The theme, style, and mood in her fiction. Is there a connection between those and her career at the UN and her work as a translator?
Yes. I mean, I think it's certainly, her work at the UN inspired that collection, The People in Glass Houses, right? There's a whole story collection that is sort of about, bureaucratic modern office life, or what was then modern office life. And obviously, the themes, and I'm sure some of the experience she had at the UN is carried over in, I don't know about her work as a translator. I don't actually know enough about her time at the UN specifically, but I mean, I think it's very clear that when you have, Adam Vale coming in to petition, British officials on behalf of a Latin American poet who's, facing execution, and, I just think her work is constantly informed by that, and obviously she wrote 2 nonfiction books about the UN specifically.
She does lend the translating to Caro.
Yes, right, that's right.
So there's a little autobiographical fill-up there.
Yeah.
But I also feel like there's a distillation that someone who works that closely with language would be most comfortable with, and the translation may come to play there.
Yeah.
I mean, she was once asked if she felt like an expatriate, and by a New York Times reporter, I think, and she said to the reporter, "I don't know even what country I could be an expatriate from."
Oh my.
So there was definitely that, that sense of worldliness, but was also a dislocation at the same time.
Okay, we're just about to wrap up here, but I wanted to ask you about one line that struck me while I was just paging through on the way here, where she writes, "The tragedy is not that love dies. The tragedy is that love continues." Is that a positive statement?
Is it a catastrophic, devastating book, or is it the greatest love story you've ever read?
Yes.
Right?
That's the question. Only you can know. You must read this book. Thank you all so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.